Welcome to Conversations That Matter. Joining me as always is correspondent Mike Manier. Mike, who do we have on the show today?
Stu, today we have Eoin Madden. Eoin is a full-time advocate for the Wilderness Committee. Says it's the largest citizen-funded advocacy group for the environment in Canada. Eoin has an interesting story. He's from Ireland originally and said he saw firsthand the effects of coal and realized that climate change was something he needed to know more about. And so he actually left a very successful practice as a criminal lawyer to get a graduate degree in climate change. I didn't even know such a thing existed, but he has a graduate degree in climate change, came to British Columbia, probably one of the epicenters in the world for the discussion on climate change. He's been to the oil sands. He has a lot to say on the question of oil sands projects that are proposed in BC, but his approach is really about biodiversity, cumulative effects, which is something you hear a lot. Let's not just look at one project. We've got to look at all of these projects, including mining of minerals, coal, LNG, bitumen. All of it has to be looked at. All of it has to be looked at critically for us to make sure that we have what Eoin would call a sustainable future.
Well, it's interesting that you talk about his background because he gives a very reasoned and sensible approach to what it is that he's hoping to have happen in the midst of a debate that is piled on with emotional rhetoric.
He acknowledges what a lot of people in the resource industry saying is a key fact that gets missed from the debate. What about consumers? Consumers are the ones that are driving demand for all of these products that need to be mined and shipped from Canada and other countries around the world. Eoin acknowledges that that is a fair point, that it's a real issue, and that we can't have this discussion without also talking about consumers and the role that they have in driving the need for a resource-based economy in Canada.
A very interesting man. Let's now go to that conversation that we recorded here on September the 8th. Thanks for joining me.
Good to be here.
You know, you're here under the topic of pipelines, which is the beginning of where I think our discussion will begin. I'm not sure that it will end there, because I can't help but think that pipelines are part of a larger continuum. They are just one part of it. Am I right about that?
Totally. First off, a guy with an Irish accent, what's he doing here? I am in the country a number of years, and I do want to be a Canadian. Pipelines for me have become the reason for us to get engaged in a very important conversation, and that's about climate change. It's also about the worth of our natural world, what drives sort of BC's economy. It is a much, much, much bigger conversation. I'm sad to say it has been horrendously polarized. I'm very, very glad that you're doing this because it helps us get away from those polar snapshot pieces and get into the real issue. For me, pipelines are an excuse to have a conversation about the biggest challenge facing humanity, and that's climate change.
It is one component, and what happens though is you get people who will focus on pipelines, you'll get people who will focus on tankers, you'll get somebody else who will focus on the extraction of oil from the oil sands or any other way in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And so it's the movement of that product, it's the extraction of it. But let's talk about pipelines first of all. Do you have issues specifically about pipelines, and what are they?
Well, it's more the issue of what's in the pipeline than the pipeline itself, and that's a really key distinction. A pipeline is just a piece of metal in the ground. It causes a certain amount of deforestation, and it does cause spills. We've seen that with Kinder Morgan here in Burnaby in 2007. It's not if, but when, and there is no foolproof system. Obviously, everything we do on an energy front has an impact. It is what is in the pipelines that is a key issue. And again, I'm glad this conversation is happening because I feel that doesn't really get out there as much. You've seen First Nations step up to the plate in relation to pipelines. A lot of them are talking about the 6 or 7 generations ahead of us and what they're going to live in and what their world is going to be like. It's as much about what's in the pipelines as the pipeline itself. It's as much about the effect of having a construction project with this, a pipeline which would spill at some point, as it is about the bitumen process in Alberta mixed with a diluent and sent down that pipeline and being burned into our atmosphere and causing ever-increasing amounts of damage on a climate front. 2 examples in BC, our pine beetle infestation and the loss of our shellfish industry.
Okay, let me stop you there for a second, because one of the things that I think is important in this debate is that we address, well, what would be the issues around the integrity of a pipeline per se?
Yeah.
Because so often when I get involved in this conversation, there's a touch and go on pipelines, and then it's off to climate change, or what do we do about this? We touch on something else. And it's easy to bring in all that evidence, but the pipeline itself, and this is the thing that I want to take a look at first, because, and partly because I hear people say, well, if you move oil down there, then I have a concern. But if it's natural gas, it's okay.
Yeah.
When I take a look at the evidence about ruptures in pipelines, just in British Columbia, there's far more ruptures with natural gas than there are with oil.
Yeah.
And when I look at what's happened with oil, there's a tremendous kind of recovery rate on the product that has been spilled. They don't get it all. There's absolutely no way that they can. Mm-hmm. But with natural gas, there's no recovery.
Right.
Like and so why is it that psychologically, and maybe that's the thing, that we go, oh, it's okay for LNG or natural gas, but not okay for oil. We're talking about a pipeline.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I fully agree. In isolation, the choice, pipeline versus an LNG pipeline, or a pipeline versus oil by rail, it doesn't really encapsulate the real issues. A lot of the time, I feel that the narrative, this conversation, is driven by those who message on it, industry, and those who recycle that messaging, our newspapers. But very often, the conversation is narrowed on these very small, specific conversations, when the conversation is about, do we want more fossil fuels or less?
From your perspective, you're talking to somebody who, most people live in this environment, and they kind of go, well, I like driving my car, and I like having my computer convince me. And so isn't there value in being able to say, but here's the way that a pipeline is made. Here's how, where its weaknesses are, and be as specific as possible. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to pipelines, what is it about a pipeline that you go, this is the real concern when it comes to maintaining the integrity of the system so that we don't get that cataclysmic spill? Like, where is the weak point?
The weak point is the piece of your question, I think, where you said, we don't. And we come from the perspective that we will. Mm-hmm. It's a question of time. No amount of money seemingly spent on technology can eradicate the risk. And like the example I use is the Columbia Space Shuttle, which received billions upon billions of dollars in safety provision, NASA's best, all worked on safety, and we still had a problem, a catastrophic problem.
Twice.
A great example is the Exxon Valdez. Now, the story behind the Exxon Valdez is quite simple. The night that the Exxon Valdez got in trouble and sank, there was top-class navigation provision on that boat. Top-class radar, cost a lot of money, well beyond what the standard was at the time, and advertised as any oil company, or pipeline company would advertise as, going beyond where we have to go to keep this thing safe. On the night itself, that was switched off, and it was switched off because Exxon didn't want to spend the money, given market circumstances, on maintaining the machinery. The problem is that there is no, we can stop this. It's the conversation about how much risk and damage is worthwhile is correct. We should have that conversation, absolutely. But I think a lot of people in BC are coming from the perspective of, this is Enbridge. If it's the Enbridge pipeline, we've seen what happened in Kalamazoo. This is different to crude oil. It's bitumen, and it seems to react differently in the marine environment. The federal government followed up and said, yes, that's true. There's a large body of evidence that says that, spending on welding, you could say welding is something we should all chat about.
Which is important in pipelines.
It is absolutely important in pipelines, and I'm not avoiding that. You could talk about lasers that are breached by a spill and react increasingly. The track record is where people look. They look at market circumstances. If the technology is incredibly expensive to bring in, who's to guarantee that it will actually be operated like we saw with Exxon? You are, if you could sort of summarize it, you're coming from a place of deep mistrust given the track record involved here.
Okay, but is that accurate? And I ask this because I'm curious to know. I go and I do research and I look at it and it says of the billions of barrels of oil that are transported back and forth across North America, and 99.999% of it arrives safely at its destination. And then there are incidents like Kalamazoo where it didn't, and it was exacerbated by human error. And so, but is it appropriate for us to look at that one incident and say, therefore, don't do it? When we consider the demands of our modern life, and this is the thing that I think is hard to try and figure out.
I think that when we look at the damage and potential damage from a pipeline, there are things that we absolutely do not take into account. We don't take into account what's happening upstream. We don't take into account the guaranteed absolute spill the day that oil gets out there into the atmosphere in the shape of climate change. Right? So we have to look at the broad spectrum of what these pipelines actually mean. If we, in my opinion, if we get right down to just talking about is the actual structural integrity of a pipeline safe versus other technologies, that's a very simple conversation to have.
What's your answer to that question?
You could arrive at the fact that maybe statistically oil in a pipeline is less likely to spill than on a train. They've looked at those and they've seen how much oil spills when a train crashes. It seems to be slightly less, but the train crashes happen more often. I don't deny that there is a conversation very focused on that. What I always say is that doesn't cover even half of the real issues.
This is a little bit of a sidebar here. Do you know that the first pipeline in North America was built to get the oil from the wellhead to the train? Because before that, it used to travel by horse-drawn cart in old oak whiskey barrels. And that's where the term a barrel of oil came from. And so they built the pipeline to make it safer to get from the oil, like the wellhead, to the railroad. So railroads and the movement of oil have been around for a long time.
I mean, if I sit down with a conversation about someone about the whole spectrum of issues raised by a pipeline, and they make the point, pipelines are relatively safe, I won't fight that. I'll say that there are times when they spill. We can expect one to spill. I would take the eventuality of a spill and I'd say add that on to the cost of climate change, and add it on to the First Nations issues with pipelines, which basically they've been isolated, I feel, politically because of it. Take the anti-democratic activities of our federal government in promoting the oil industry, take the subsidies we give oil industry, and if you can take all those issues into account and have that conversation, which I think the safety of a pipeline, that absolutely belongs in that conversation.
So just to be clear, and then we can put pipelines aside, because I think I sense this coming into our conversation, that you can say, well, I can look at a pipeline and say, well, okay, for the most part it does exactly what it's designed to do. The real issue is what it's a part of. I did some research about a professor from Oxford University by the name of Nick Bostrom. And he's in statistical analysis related to the humanities. And I looked him up because I started thinking, as I was preparing for you and I to have our conversation, what is it that has happened in the course of human history where we've gone from saying, I have to navigate my way around that risk because I don't even have the ability to manage anything because we didn't understand the world the way we do today. Over the last 150, 200 years, we've grown pretty good at being able to control or manage risk. But in the last little while, we started to move into a frame of mind where we're starting to say, but I want to be able to eliminate risk. What happened and why did this happen? So Bostrom's hypothesis is that we've moved into, and this is where I think climate change fits in, is we're saying, well, if we get this wrong, we're running an existential risk that when cataclysmic will lead to the annihilation of life as we know it.
we're there.
Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely, and it's one of, if there is an inconvenient truth, it's that we are pushing the boundaries of our own ability to survive on this planet, and a lot of people would say we're well beyond that, and we're currently killing the very life support system that we need to survive.
So at the core of it, that's really your concern, isn't it?
My concern is that if we don't take action soon, and if we don't avail of the opportunities like pipeline conversations to take a step back and say, what direction are we moving in? That really, I may work for an environmental organization, but my true employers, people that really I answer to, are my nieces and my nephews. And if there's one thing that I really concerns me, it's being able to look them in the eye and say that I did the best I could to create the scenario where we could talk about their ability to live the way we've lived. And that absolutely is hanging in the balance in our generation at this time. And that is a very, I think, intimidating reality for a lot of people. It's a reality I've lived in for quite some time. And I hope that your conversations you're hosting here help people to say, well, let's just climb into this conversation now. I feel that if even economically, even if we were to look at, say, hey, look, oil exports is how Canada is going to prosper. And that is very much a line that reverberates across Canada. If you look at what the world as a society needs to do on climate change alone, it has to get off oil. And the first casualty of that is tar sands oil, or oil sands oil, if you want to be from a different perspective. What that's about is it has an added impact on the climate than any other type of oil. So it's the first to go. It will be the first to go. And I believe we are fighting as much for the Canadian economy as we are for anything else. When I hear the federal government say our prosperity lies in tar sands oil, I don't believe that. I absolutely don't believe that.
Well, where do you think it lies then?
Here. There's so many intelligent people in this country, so highly educated. The tragedy is that we have these graduates come out from universities. I met folks in UBC. I went out to speak to them about environmental issues. I met guys who stood in front of me and said, we can extract wood from our forests in a sustainable way that doesn't impact the forest survivability. That's hopeful. That's an industry. There are certain ways of generating geothermal. I'm told by that industry that we're sitting on enormous quantities of geothermal generating potential.
Well, I've spoken to geoscientists about this very topic, and they say, well, that may be true, but if you think the cost of extracting oil is high, the cost of setting up geothermal plants that are going to be able to replace energy sources that we currently need, it's a stretch. And there doesn't seem to be an appetite for it right now, both on the investment side and on the user side. So, well, it's an idea. It's one that, so how do we get there? Like we can't just sort of go, okay, stop here, we're over there. It doesn't have to be kind of a step-by-step sort of process that allows us to gradually move from one energy source to another.
Absolutely. And that's the piece where there would be some days where I walk away from a conversation and I say, I had to give away a bit there. So I'm not in denial about the fact that the tar sands industry is large and employs a lot of people, produces a lot of oil. It's not going to disappear overnight. There is a strategy to get from where we are now to where we ought to go. And I think a lot of the impetus for the drive for this very heated pipeline conversation is federal policy on that front. We are the only nation in the world to leave the international agreement on climate change. We have what seems to be quite close to denial of the realities of climate change from an economic perspective from our government. And that really drives people to the debate, which is in a way a good thing.
Let's use an example here in British Columbia. The Mid-Coast Agreement that came about 12, 13 years ago was a dedicated effort by a bunch of people who said, we are not managing this resource properly. Forest companies initially were absolutely opposed to them. But ultimately they came together and came up with a formula that everybody said, okay, we can live with this.
Mm-hmm.
And there will be people, I'm sure that there will be people who watch this right now as I say it,
Mm-hmm.
and say, yeah, but look at all those people who lost their jobs. Look at the transformation of that industry. It's never fully recovered. Like, I'm afraid of that. And so if I go back to Nick Bostrom's work, he talks about existential risk, which is the thing that you are the most concerned about. But he says on the other side of it is flawed realization as a risk. In the sense that we bring ourselves to a technological point and then we go, I'm afraid of the best worst case scenario, so therefore I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to bring it to maturity, and then not be able to realize what the benefit beyond that would be.
Yeah.
And so this is the place that we find ourselves in. Can you envision a day where you say, okay, I'm not going to stand in your way around this so long as we have a conversation or there's cooperation around the way that we're going to be moving from where we are to where we need to be if we want to be a sustainable planet?
Absolutely. There's impacts with everything we do. There's going to be impacts in the solution. I've had it said, well, do windmills kill birds? I don't know. But if it's a road to a better future where my nieces and nephews can survive and be at least comfortable, then so be it. Like, there are conversations that I will end up engaging in that I'll get more flack from.
You know that somebody will grab that last little soundbite that you gave from this somewhere, and they'll use that against you.
I cannot stop that.
Yeah.
What I can do is I can say, let's be real. Let's sit down and have a conversation. There are impacts about everything we do. Some impacts are not worth it. Let's be practical. There is a way for us to get to there being a tar sands that is being slowly downsized. And part of that journey is refining, I believe. Because refining in Canada does reduce the amount of boreal forest we lose to this stuff. It slows down the rampant, out of control exploitation of the resource. I think refining in Alberta is a conversation that everyone, including me, should be part of. Refining on the west coast, you got to get it over all those salmon-bearing streams. It's a nightmare. Refining the tar sands, or oil sands, if you don't like tar sands, in Alberta is a conversation we all owe ourselves. Absolutely.
So you're looking for solutions.
Damn right.
Thank you very
Love
much.
it.
Thanks
Nice
for
to
taking
meet
the time to do that.